Welcome back to PHIL 2103, Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics. The question of the week for these lectures now is, does God exist? And the answer to that question is going to shape the worldview, the lens through which you see all of life. If God exists, and He really exists, then that means that we as humans have a certain set of rules and guidelines, a certain person that we should look out to. That means that relativism may not be true because there is an absolute that exists. If God does not exist, then that means that we as humans are our own governing bodies. That means that the world is relative to one another. And it means that we have an individual responsibility to be the kings of our own world. There are three basic responses to this question, does God exist? The first is theistic. The theistic response is that yes, God does exist. The opposite of that is the atheistic view, that is, God does not exist. And then a third, more moderate position in between them is agnosticism, or the agnostic would say that we can't know if God exists. There may be a God, or perhaps there is not a God. Over the next few minutes in this lecture, I'm going to present to you the idea that I believe, at least, the agnostic position and the theistic position have a much greater weight than the atheistic position. The atheistic position, saying that God does not exist, seems to go against the evidence that exists in this world. Agnosticism, meaning there's at least a possibility that God exists, or theism, the response that God does exist, seem to be the stronger positions. But now, if we do say that God exists, the next question that we have to ask is, what sort of God exists? If God exists, who is this God person then anyway? The classical theistic response then would be that God is the omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent creator of the universe. This answer would be the typical answer that you would find in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theological systems. The next one would be deism. Deism says that God exists, and God did create the universe, but He created it in the same way that one would create a watch. This watch doesn't require that its creator meticulously watch over it. It only requires that He created it and set it in motion and then step away. In the same way, deistic thinkers say that God created the universe but then turned away from it. The next view is pantheism. Pantheism says that God is everywhere and that God and nature are one. This would be similar to panentheism, which says that God is in nature and is in everything. The next one would be the New Age conception. The New Age conception of God says that God is a spiritual and personal guide, but oftentimes one that we choose. So let's look then to the defense of classical theism, because of course Christianity falls under the classical theistic view. There are many arguments that say that God exists, and I'm going to present each of them to you with a varying degree of effectiveness, because each degree has its own weight to it, or each argument has its own weight to it. But I will argue in this that there is enough evidence between the sum total of all the arguments for God's existence to at the very least say that God likely or probably exists. However, I do believe there is plenty of evidence enough to say that God does exist, and a very specific God in that. There are typically a few different branches of argumentation for the defense of God. This is called apologetics. Apologetics means to create an argument and defend that God does exist. And a work I could highly recommend on this is the Popular Encyclopedia of Apologetics by Ergen Kainer. In this, he points out that there are cosmological arguments, that is to say that everything we see is dependent upon something else as its cause, and nothing exists on its own. We know that as we look into science, there are things that are caused by other events, and therefore, if we go back to the uncaused caused, as Aristotle put it, then we will find God in that. The next branch is teleological arguments. Teleological arguments are based on our amazement at the design, sequencing, and even the beauty that we find in the world around us. And then there are moral arguments. Moral arguments are generated by the inescapable and clearly universal recognition of right and wrong. As we talked about in previous lectures, there are at least some categories of moral choices that seem to be true for all generations across time. There is no known society that lacks some form of ethic. The next category would be religious experience. Religious experience is an inductive argument that God exists based on religious experiences that have been had throughout the world. The problem with this argument is that the widespread nature of these experiences happens with physical objects and are often contradictory to one another in nature. So if one has a religious experience under the Buddhist system and another has a religious experience under the Christian system, can those two both be pointing to the same God? There's also a question of the trustworthiness of religious experiences. Some who have experimented with drugs or other inhibiting factors and then have a religious experience may not be as trustworthy as another religious experience. So let's go back to the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument infers God's existence from the existence of the universe or the cosmos. What this requires is a necessary being, that is, one that has always existed, is self-explanatory, and is also self-sufficient. And it requires the principle of sufficient reason. That is, that anything that exists must have an explanation. So, ergo, I can look at my watch and know by seeing my watch that there was someone who created that watch. There was a watchmaker. And therefore, I can also look at the world around me and know that just as a watch must exist because there must be a watchmaker, there exists a world, a universe, that has delicately balanced systems that imply there must be a creator. Virtually every culture across the history of time has some form of creation story that have two key components. The things in our world have causes, and there is a creating or initiating God. This line of thinking was developed early on by Aristotle in the 6th century BC and was later adopted and used by Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 19 through 20. Their Aristotelian argument was later rephrased in the last decade by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland as the following logical format argument. 1. There cannot be an actual infinite, that is, a universe existing infinitely in time. 2. Therefore, the universe has a beginning. 3. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause to exist. And 4. Therefore, there must be an uncaused cause. Again, this is just an update of what Aristotle taught in the 6th century BC. Next argument is the design argument. The design argument says that there are carefully arranged and organized entities, and these are likely the work of an intelligent creator. This competing hypothesis with this would be that of traditional creationism, the theory of evolution, and then the intelligent design argument that comes from this. Each has an argument that is based in the same intelligent creator, whether that be nature, whether that be God himself, or the deistic intelligent God who created the world and stepped back and stepped away from it. Using the teleological argument, apologists such as Ray Comfort have come up with various scenarios. For example, Ray Comfort says that creation implies a creator. So if we were to walk into the middle of the woods and we were to find a Coke can there, we would not say, oh, look at that Coke can that nature has created. We would know that some human force has been here and that someone created that Coke can. In the same way, if we walked through the middle of a forest and then suddenly came upon a house, we would not suggest or come up with the idea that nature had just grown a house out in the middle of the woods. We would know there must be someone who lived there. This is again based on Romans 1:20, saying that we know the design of God. It's apparent for all to see, even from the beginning of creation. So these are the first basic arguments towards God. Aristotle, the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, all the way down to apologists of today like William Lane Craig, are looking at creation and saying this created order has to have some intelligence behind it. Now, in the next video, we'll look at some other classical arguments for the existence of God. So let's start that journey together.